modernism and postmodernism. Not gonna lie, it's something we all get stuck with from time to time. We're all taught it, and we're all given a definition at one point in our lives, but let's face it, we all tend to forget. See, part of the problem with the two words is that both of them come simultaneously within the same century. They both fall in the beginning to the end of the 20th. And we, as a modern society in the 21st century, are kind of stuck as to what relation these two movements have to us. Because surely we're modern, right? What's the difference between modernism and postmodernism? Why are these two dichotomous situations fall into the same continuum when we define them? They're complicated terminologies, which is why, hi, my name is Cinzia Dubois and I am the Unemployed Philosopher, and welcome to the first lecture in the Unemployed Philosophers Club. Today's lecture's objective is to define the difference between modernism and postmodernism, try and work out characteristics where we can apply the two terms together and identify modernist and postmodernist literature in our own spare time. So let's start with the basics. What is the definition of modernism and postmodernism, and why do we find these two so confusing? Well, if you do find the two confusing, then you're not alone, because let's face it, they are complicated and they're very overlapping. See, although they are discussed as two dichotomous artistic movements in the 20th century, they perpetually fall into a continuum. One can't exist without the other. Most confusingly, as Lyotard put it in his work defining the postmodern, a work can become modern only if it is first postmodern. Postmodernism, thus understood, is not modernism at its end, but in its nascent nature. This state is constant. Are you confused as well? I don't blame you, but that's the whole point of this. Modernism is a series of cultural movements that originated from the Enlightenment in the late 19th to the early 20th century. Modernism wasn't a movement that only happened in the literary world. It happened in the art world in general, in architecture, anthropology, and even the music world. The important features to understand with modernism is that the whole idea of the modernist movement was making it new, which is the mantra of, as you probably know, Ezra Pound. Inspired by thinkers such as René Descartes, it can be defined as a radical change of thought away from the Enlightenment that focused on looking at logic, rationale, and also science. It was highly influenced by the works of Isaac Newton. The modernists were extremely excited by the potential of capitalism and industry and materiality, and they embraced that kind of change. And what modernism celebrated most prominently was the liberation that they felt from the social sciences. And that reflected in their literary writings. Modernists were all very different. They all had different political agendas, and therefore you cannot say things like, well, modernists were the first political writers, because that's not entirely true. For example, James Joyce and Virginia Woolf are both well-known modernists, but Virginia Woolf really critiqued Joyce's work, regardless of the similarities in stylistic prose, such as the stream of consciousness or the fragmentation that they both shared. Virginia Woolf thought Joyce's work was the work of a bar boy. All modernist writers are very different, however you have to consider the fact that they all wrote in the same context, and although they had different objectives to their writing, they all secretly held the same hope for a universal truth. You see, through rationale and logic, the modernists claimed that they could come to a universal reality. See, what the modernists all hoped for was discovering a universal truth, a universal march that they all went along with to create an egalitarian society. The earlier 20th century was extremely fragmented, and again that reflects in their structure. You see through the stream of consciousness and the breakdown of the wasteland that nothing really makes sense. They all work in fragmentation. And it goes deep into the human psychology, which was again influenced by recent works of Freud. So there is no real concrete evidence that most modernist writers read works like Freud. I mean, Virginia Woolf didn't mention that she even read any of the works of Freud until near the end of her lifespan in the 1930s. As their main critique was the bourgeois society, they actually moved away from high art into low art, going down to the depths of human nature and straight into the psychiatry. Aside from that, they were all writing in the same contextuality. They all believed that rationale and logic was the answer to solving most of our problems. And that wasn't necessarily the nature of beauty, but more the nature of simplicity, and breaking the fragments and building something entirely new out of the structure that they were left with. Modernist writers rejected realism, and they can be characterized by a hierarchical, determinative, organized nature of logic. And they were highly influenced by the individual consciousness, and they believed that by building and understanding the depth of yourself, you were able to move towards a more universal and unified answer. In the in-depth analysis of the individual subject to understand and determine and find a worldview that was applicable to everybody. Postmodernism isn't a rejection of modernism per se, but it is a critique of it. The postmodernist movement came after the Second World War. And one can use the idea that when you're trying to identify postmodernist writing, you can use the description that Lyotard gave, which was that writers in the postmodernist period, or writers who are writing in a postmodernist style, are those who are writing in a post-traumatic stress disorder. The postmodernist period was essentially a shell shock from everything that happened around them. And although not fully disconnected from the modernist period, they were very satirical and critical of it, and wanted to move away from it, not in a complete reverse way. You then end up going back to Romanticism, but actually more of a twisting of it and looking at it more critically. Left in a state of complete disenchantment from the world wars, what the postmodernists looked at was a society which lacked a central hierarchy and was chaotic in its state, was still manipulated and monopolised by bureaucratic power. And this is what the postmodernists wanted people to wake up to. For they saw danger in the way that the modernists applied their central hierarchy. The postmodernists rejected that there was any universal truth at all, and if there were such a statement, it would be extremely dangerous and damaging. You see, what they saw from the idea of having a universal answer was actually very fascist in its movement. Trying to make everybody think the same way was actually very similar to that of Auschwitz. The postmodernists rejected the idea that there wasn't universal truth, that everything was actually subjective, that there was no morality or even rationality in the world. They saw danger in what Lyotard called the meta-narrative, and actually embraced local narratives and the diversity of them. But however, rather than give a solution to it, they essentially deconstructed the world around them. Rather than go in depth as modernists did, they stayed very surface level. A very strong example of the danger that the postmodernists saw in the universality of the world, it can be very neatly highlighted in the novel J.G. Ballard's High Rise, which you may have seen the film of. If you do see the film, that gives you a very clean example of the postmodernist movement. This beautiful, clean, ornate, high-rise building, which looks all the same concrete, the same building, everybody has the same shaped rooms, and yet you see a breakdown in the mentality within it, that there can be no universality, that there has to be a hierarchy in a system or else everybody falls apart. And again, if you read or see High Rise, you will see that kind of low and high art come together. You see the beauty and clarity and simplicity get completely dragged down by pornography, crudity and pop culture. And that was essentially what the postmodernists did. They brought high and low art together to criticise society and criticise the modernist movement. The modernists celebrated the potential of a new capitalist society. The postmodernists were drowning in it. They saw it as destroying our own human nature, and that people were becoming passive to it. What the postmodernists wanted to do was highlight the society's entrenchment in bureaucratic powers and monopoly. And sensitised by thinkers such as Marx, Freud and the Frankfurt School, they wished to highlight the manipulation society was undergoing through mechanisms of machinery and advertising, the repressive nature of the ideological legal apparatus, and the dominant discourses which were perpetually silencing the wide voices of society. The heroes of modernist literature are themselves a hero in their own adventure of the mind. The modernist hero seems to be drowning in a world of corruption, pornography, sex, money and drugs. Yet he has dirt on his hands because he was born from it, he's a witnesser of it, and he's a partaker in it. And that doesn't make him necessarily an anti-hero, but more of a victim of his own surroundings. Postmodernists were driven by an unscientific, irrational rationale that was driven by an indeterminate, irrational, anarchical, non-totalized state of knowledge. Were influenced largely by the hyper-reality that was perpetualized by the media. Where morality and knowledge could be defined and understood by the modernists, the postmodernists said neither could be defined and all was subjective. Rather like Einstein's theory of relativity, everything was relative to the postmodernists and nothing could be ever concreted. Everything was moving within each other and there was no right or singular answer. Where the main critique of the modernist movement was the bourgeois society, the main critique of the postmodernists were the modernists. For they argued that the modernists had a fascist way about them, which legitimised the idea that control belonged to the hands of the few, although it all seemingly promised liberation at the end of it. New influences in the postmodernist movement were writers such as Nietzsche, Derrida and Heidegger, again influenced by Marxist and Freudian analysis. The postmodernists argued and highlighted the importance of economic and psychological forces, and were not bound by the reason that the modernists had claimed was the answer to having an egalitarian social society. The postmodernist movement goes into more detail, for there are two formative competing movements within postmodernism, which you may have heard of: structuralism and post-structuralism. But again, that's a little bit more detailed and perhaps would need a lecture entirely dedicated to defining those two terms as well. So that, my friends, leaves with the final image, the match. What has this match got to do with anything? The flame. See, the best imagery I can give to you to describe the difference between modernism and postmodernism is looking at a burning match. This represents modernism, this represents postmodernism. And the match is the modern society. A repeated image in modernist writing including the works of Virginia Woolf, Joseph Conrad, T.S. Eliot, is the flickering of the self, the flickering of knowledge, the flickering of senses, and the flickering of universal truth. The idea of a flickering light is that which the modernists cling to. That's all the modernists can see. In their fragmented societies, in their fragmented selves, all they can identify and see before they reach true enlightenment is the flickering of it. Whilst postmodernists blew out the flame. The postmodernists look at the burnt charts. Postmodernists saw the danger in driving towards a universal truth and a universal state of mind. For war and nuclear weapons, they saw the unwanted side effects of advancing knowledge. They saw that the only method to achieving a universal society was through war and destruction, and even then they could identify that it was never going to be successful. Thus concludes my first brief lecture on the difference between modernism and postmodernism. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy this lecture and you would like me to create more, then please, I would really appreciate if you consider perhaps becoming one of my patrons. I have a Patreon account purely for this lecture series because, as the title suggests, I am the unemployed philosopher, but I would really love to be able to do this more full time, perhaps do it on a weekly basis rather than perhaps monthly or fortnightly. I'd like to do as many lectures as possible, but as a patron, you decide what I do a lecture on. Are you curious about how the novel came to be? Are you curious in Victorian literature? Maybe you'd like me to do a lecture on Ulysses, or perhaps a lecture on structuralism versus post-structuralism, Enlightenment, classical literature, ancient classics, philosophy of ancient classics, perhaps even Socrates or Plato. It's entirely up to you what I make a lecture on. I will do the research for it and hopefully I'll be able to edit them and get better and more confident as the series progresses. But thank you very much for my first 3 patrons. I cannot thank you enough for your support. You're the reason I made this first lecture, and I'm sorry if it was a little bit stammery. It's my first time, and again, it's very difficult to do a lecture by yourself without having a script or anything like that. I mean, I did try to script it, but I understood that my nerves got the better of me, and I realised that if I didn't do this now, I'd never do it. I have to have a go. You can only progress. Or can you, says the postmodernist in me. At the end of every lecture, I intend to give you a reading list of suggested readings in case you were interested in anything that came up in this lecture. So down below in the description box, you will see an array of literature that I've suggested. I've included some modernist texts such as James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, etc., and some postmodernist texts which you may have read already and not realise they were postmodernist, such as Beloved by Toni Morrison, Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, or The Secret Library by Haruki Murakami. Postmodernism is far more accessible to us as writers and readers than the modernist society, because we are far more disenchanted from the modernists make it new than we are actually in a postmodern society, because sadly we do live in a postmodernist society. But not everyone who chooses to write literature in modern society is a postmodernist writer, and that's what, again, I think a lot of people find confusing. Don't put a burning matchstick on a bookshelf, Chinsia. That's not smart. You're meant to be the unemployed philosopher who's meant to have some kind of level of understanding, but I think you've proved to everyone that you may not. Yes, I would really appreciate it if you took a time to become a patron on my Patreon account. I will link it down below along with a suggested reading list of other books that you may be interested in reading should you want to read more about postmodernism or modernism. And if you did enjoy this lecture, then please, by all means, I appreciate any shares, comments or likes that you may have. If you share it, that would mean the world to me, because it would mean that you actually really enjoyed it and you think that I'm good at what I do, because I would love to be good at what I do. I really want to lecture. The nerves may have got the better of me this time, but I promise you I will endeavour to improve. I really hope that you found it enjoyable, and I will see you next time for another, hopefully, lecture. See you soon, guys. Pip pip!